I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know the discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello and welcome to my very first I Barely Got Here podcast episode. I'll be your host, Kevin Boontjer. As this is the first one, I'd like to introduce myself and tell you what I have planned. I'm retired from law enforcement. I worked for over 24 years with the same department here in the Phoenix metro area, and I retired at the rank of a sergeant. I worked in patrol both as an officer and a sergeant. That's where you wear a uniform and you drive the marked car. You're first on most scenes. It's kind of what most people would picture if they hear or think about the term of a police officer. I worked in the downtown area on a detail down there. We dealt with large crowds. There's a lot of bars, a lot of drunks, a lot of future attorney/college kids who always wanted to help us better interpret and understand the law, which would sometimes get them arrested right alongside with their friend/client, much to their objection, but you get the idea down there. There's a lot of special events. New Year's block party, 4th of July, and at the height of some of these events, they had 100,000 plus people attend. I was a field training officer for a couple of years. That's where you get the people that are fresh out of the academy, and they've learned all the things that they need in the academy, but now they need to come out and learn how things work on the street, so to speak. So they ride with a veteran officer, and they typically do that anywhere from, a month or two up to some programs are 4, 5, 6 months now. I was a department trainer on a number of topics, firearms, defensive tactics, taser, and some others. And I usually taught those in-house or for our own department or for our SWAT team. But on occasion, you would go outside and you would help other departments with that as well and provide them some instruction. And then I come to what I call home. I did about 16 years total as both a detective and a sergeant in our Special Investigations Bureau. We did a lot of UC work, and that would be drug buys, drug activity type of things, but also prostitution, buying stolen property. And then there was a lot of using your plainclothes capabilities to help with other bureaus' investigations and or while conducting surveillance. Which brings me to surveillance. Probably did thousands of hours, as a lot of people will, in that bureau of surveillance, which is sitting in your hot, nasty car, either by yourself or working as a cover team or an arrest team that's waiting to jump out and arrest somebody. And all those vehicles that we use for surveillance were unmarked, plain vehicles. So in that bureau, the vast majority of the people had, I believe everybody did, had what we call a take-home car. And what that did was that facilitated or that allowed us to respond directly from home to any type of a call-out situation, which in special investigations, they were frequent. It was probably at least one a week, whether it was regard to a investigative call-out or needing to help with arresting a fugitive and going straight to that location. That way, all of your gear, all of your equipment stays within your vehicle and you could go straight to the problem. We did a number of wiretaps in that bureau. Most of those are drug-related. They involved huge amounts of cash, huge amounts of drugs, and sweeping large-scale arrests. The largest cash seizure that we had on any given warrant that I was part of was $1.1 million, which is a lot of cash. And then for the other drugs with, regard to meth, I can remember seizures in excess of 50 pounds. Heroin, at least a few pounds there. Marijuana, I can remember a couple seizures that were over a ton. And during the course of my career while I was in there, I think I worked on about 8 of those. 5 of those I was a manager or supervisor, and the other 3 I helped out when I was a detective. I was never the lead or the case agent, so the majority of my work was, if I was managing, was supervising. And when I was a detective, a lot of surveillance work and a lot of the takedowns or arrests that would follow. And during these investigations, especially when I was a supervisor, your entire squad, we'd work out of city just as much as we'd work in city. And the reason for that is because based on where your investigation takes you, you have to follow the product and you follow the players. So if they're in an adjacent city, or if they're not even in an adjacent city, maybe somewhere down in Tucson, that's where we'd go. We'd work on complex investigations, something that was long-term, complicated, time-consuming, things that took a lot of time away from other detectives being able to do their job, so we would take some of those on. One example is when I was buying stolen night vision equipment from a guy who was getting them from someone inside the manufacturing plant that was stealing them and sneaking them out. It was a really cool case, and something like that wrapped up with actually us going to Las Vegas, taking charge and taking custody of a couple of the last people that were involved in that investigation. Another good example is stolen identity investigations, which involve numerous victims, and a lot of the victims, they don't even know that they're a victim yet. I had a couple of guys that worked these really, really well, and they would spend weeks on these things and just hours and hours and hours. Had to be really patient. The investigations typically turned out really well, and we get some really good charges on those. We'd chase after fugitives. We'd go after dangerous felony suspects for other work groups as well as our own, and these suspects would be wanted for crimes such as homicide, aggravated assault, kidnap, sex assault, and robberies, to name a few. We took care of the vast majority of the search warrant service for the department. Anybody who's been in that bureau for a length of time will have done well over 100, and the best recollection that I have when I tried to quantify the number was I believe I've done about 900 over the course of my career. And those run anywhere from a low risk or paper warrant, as we call it, to where you're essentially sometimes going to an office and you're serving the search warrant because you're going to take a certain amount of paperwork or a file from a certain filing cabinet or something like that, to a high-risk no-knock warrant, which a high-risk no-knock warrant is a search warrant where, and typically we did the majority of these when we were working the crack houses. What it is you've ascertained and you've determined through your investigation that it is so dangerous to even deal with that place to begin with that you want the permission from the court to do away with the knock and the announce and the pause or the wait at the door. So you want permission to go up, hit the door, and make immediate entry so that you can go in and control these people before they even have time to figure out what's going on. And that's essentially what a no-knock warrant is. Not very many of them get granted. They don't happen, probably not even 1 in 50. It has to be a certain set of circumstances, and you really don't want to abuse that request either with the courts. I was also a manager for our EOD unit, the Explosive Ordnance Disposal or Bomb Squad. And in that, these techs would do call-outs, work special events, sweeping for any kind of suspicious packages. And the easiest way to quantify that position is whenever anything went boom or was about to or it looked like it might, then these guys and myself would have to go out and deal with it. I was also on the SWAT team for a little over 20 years, and that is considered a collateral duty. And what that means is, in addition to all the things that I just explained that I did during the normal course of my workday, I was also on the SWAT team, and that would mean that I would respond to call-outs. I had to go to mandatory trainings. I would take care of helping take care of equipment issues, just really anything that came up. But it was in addition to all those other things that you did. And SWAT deals with the things that you would think that they deal with. They deal with hostage situations. They deal with barricaded people. They deal with suicidal situations, which are a real bear because the problem is for one, suicide is not illegal. It's not illegal to take your life. And so you get into this strange dynamic of responding to these calls where people are threatening suicide with a handgun or a knife, which makes them a threat to the public. But at the same time, your hands are really tied because you don't necessarily have a crime that you can pursue some sort of a resolution to. So on some of those, actually, the resolution was to pack up and leave. We did hostage rescue. Hostage rescue is far and few in between, but it's a very specific type of operation for a SWAT team, and you have to really train frequently and consistently to make sure that you're prepared and ready to serve one of those call-outs and take care of it. We did high-risk operations. That would entail high-risk search warrants, kind of back to our no-knocks. That would definitely be a SWAT team operation. We provided security details for dignitaries and politicians when they are in town. And then one of the more interesting things is we provided contraband escort. So the property room for the police department is the storehouse for all the evidence, which in some cases would be a lot of dope, a lot of drugs. You're talking thousands of pounds of drugs. Well, they have to get rid of that stuff. So after cases are adjudicated, which means that they're essentially gone through the system, people have been found guilty, not guilty, whatever, the case is done with, that stuff has to be destroyed. So what happens is once or twice a year, all these thousands of pounds of drugs and whatever type of contraband that they need to get rid of in addition gets loaded up into U-Haul trucks or whatever moving truck that you have, and it gets escorted out to a place that I can't tell you where it's at, and it gets destroyed. It gets burned up in these incinerators. So it's kind of funny because you're tooling down the road. We're in our unmarked cars and we're with a couple of moving trucks, but we've got guys that are armed to the teeth protecting this load just in the event that someone gets wise to it. Because again, you're talking millions and millions of dollars of drugs that are rolling down the street that luckily nobody knows about, and to this date, nothing's ever happened to that because we keep it pretty tight on who knows when it's going to go, what route we're going to take, and that type of detail. I had a fantastic career. I'm very proud of what I did. I worked with the best there is, hands down. I accomplished all the things that I wanted to accomplish, and I feel like myself and the folks that I worked with and for really made a difference in our community with the things that I described that we had done. But I reached the point where I had to accept that it was time for me to move on, and it's not only for myself, but also for my wife, who I believe was also ready for me to be done with this career. Retirement was definitely a huge change for me, but it made all that time and effort and sweat and tears and crazy cases over all those years worth it. And for my wife, she went from my being gone a minimum of about 50 hours a week up to 70 or more hours a week if we were doing a wiretap or a larger investigation, to when I retired. Now I'm home quite a bit. So it's funny, but I'm not sure who struggled more with that change at first. Well, now I'm working as a private investigator. It means I do background investigations, I do consulting, I do case reviews, I provide expert witness assistance, and I work with attorneys, among other things. An example of something I did just recently here in the past, I provided expert testimony during a homicide trial with regard to the functionality of a handgun that was used during the incident. So doing this work allows me to still help people, keeps me busy, definitely lets me capitalize on the things that I learned and experienced as a police officer, but it's not nearly as dangerous or demanding as being a police officer or police sergeant. I provide training for current law enforcement officers and supervisors around the state of Arizona. I have 2 classes that I teach. One is how to respond to tactical situations in the patrol environment, and the other is a class on how to foster and improve your leadership skills. I've been fortunate to become a go-to person for law enforcement issues with some of the local news outlets. There are 3 networks and also the Cronkite School of Journalism that regularly reach out to me for professional opinion on critical current topics of national interest, such as police use of force, why did this officer shoot this person, active shooter responses, why couldn't police have done something differently, and other types of questions regarding law enforcement actions. And lastly, I have to admit that I am an aspiring actor. I had a role in a short film called Protocol that I did with a really cool guy, former Cardinal football player Kerry Rhodes. I had a role in a nationally released film called The Phoenix Forgotten, and then I've had some other training projects and videos. So when I say I'm an aspiring actor, I am definitely aspiring. I am not the actor. I've been really fortunate to be able to do the things now more because I enjoy doing them and not because I have to. Which brings me to why I wanted to start the podcast. So I come to really enjoy the news interviews and the process involved in the discussions on these incidents. I enjoyed the interaction with the reporters and the camera people, but most of all, I enjoyed being able to provide explanations from the law enforcement perspective to help people better understand things over all the racket and noise from the other people who, quite frankly, don't know what they're talking about. On preparing for the podcast, I listened to some of the crime and the law enforcement podcasts are out there, and I found that there's quite a bit of BS on those as well. As with other things in life, no amount of explanation or study can make up for firsthand experience as a police officer, and I plan to use that experience in a number of ways for my podcast. People try to say that they know what being a cop is about because they've maybe done a ride-along or two, or they've sat through a shift or two at the dispatcher, or the best and the most ignorant is the one where they essentially say, I've seen it on TV, I've seen it on YouTube, and I've seen and heard things on the news, so I know what's going on. Any person with common sense is going to know that they don't have a clue, and we used to laugh because we'd say that, some of these folks, they'd pee in their pants if they had to do some of the things that the average cop has to do every day. So any cop that has a lengthy career, kind of like mine, is going to have some good stories. There's scary stories and strange stories and sad and funny stories and maybe some unbelievable stories to you. But unlike the movies or television, anything that you hear on my podcast is going to be real. We may have to change a name or location here and there, but the story will be 100% factual guaranteed. Now, I won't be talking about taking down a terrorist organization and shooting 12 people during every other episode, or dismantling a bomb minutes before it was going to detonate at the New Year's Eve party and kill 100,000 people, or blood and guts every minute, or any other made-up, fictitious, or exaggerated story that are the basis for most of the entertainment media. Neither my career or anyone else's I've ever heard of has had things like that happen every week, if at all. That's movie shit, as one of my old commanders used to say when we'd talk about the latest cop movie or TV show. SWAT-based movies and TV shows are usually the best for those silly plot lines and stories because the vast majority of all SWAT operations result in little to no injury to anyone anyway. So again, I'm going to tell real stories with real descriptions, real thoughts as experienced by real cops and real first responders. So if that's what you're looking for, I should tell you to go elsewhere, and this really isn't for you, unless you want to have an open mind and hear what police work and cops are really all about. Conversely, if you want to hear about cops as supermen and women and helping little old ladies across the street and fighting off 7 ninja killers by themselves and always doing the right thing, I'd ask that you too have an open mind and listen to what things really are. I also realize that exciting stories are what people want to hear, and quite frankly, I'd rather tell. We don't remember the 8 reports that we had to write that one shift, or talking to that lonely old lady at that house down on Farmer so many times, or all the other boring calls. We remember the adrenaline rush. We remember the pursuits, the crashes, kicking doors, fights, close calls, standoffs, captures, outthinking the crooks, and all those what the calls. Podcasts seem like the perfect venue to delve into all of this and hopefully entertain and help people better understand law enforcement and first responder work and what these men and women do on a daily basis. So how'd I come up with the title? Well, the first explanation is, I barely got here. I was able to make it through a long and dangerous career with numerous close calls. Things could have turned out differently at any point, especially considering the assignments and the work and the things that myself and my work groups were called to do. I've been shot at and thankfully never hit, dragged by a car, kicked, I've had a number of hard falls, been punched, spit on, puked on, fingers cut open with a box cutter, more fights than I can remember, had at least 3 car accidents, and that's just a lot of physical wear and tear, and that doesn't even include the mental wear and tear that you experience as well. So thank God for the most part I came out in one piece. Well, the second, the funnier reason, and probably the predominant reason that I came up with the title is this is what cops hear during the course of their work, during the course of a shift, during an incident. You mentioned I barely got here to any cop and they'll probably give you a smile and a little bit of a nod. They know exactly what you're talking about. I barely got here. That's a person trying to avoid getting stuck at a scene and or getting pulled into some investigation. And often it's going to be someone who was involved. They're just trying to get away from there. So an example of that is there's a shots fired call at a party and we all respond and we're cruising up to the scene and see this guy among many that's walking out and trying to get away and they're trying to avoid eye contact just like everybody does. And so you grab this person, you say, hey, what's going on? I remember the guy says, well, I barely got here. Well, as he's doing that, of course, as a good cop, you're scanning his body and checking his hands and seeing what he's got going on. And, well, he's got blood on his hands. So I seriously doubt that this guy just barely got there. Turns out that this guy, we detain him, of course. While he was not a suspect, he had been at the scene of this crime and essentially tried to render aid to this person that did get shot. So again, I barely got here. Think it's pretty funny. Most cops will, and I just thought that it felt really, really good for a title of the podcast. So what's my plan? Well, during the course of these episodes and telling stories, I'm going to give the cop perspective as to what they think, what they say, what they do, what they experience while they're dealing with that part of society that a lot of people don't even know is out there. And some of the common themes that you're going to hear me talk about are what a stressful and thankless job it truly can be. Most cops become very cynical. You appear very emotionless on the surface, but you got to remember that we're human beings. And we have kind of some odd and, again, hard to understand coping mechanisms such as a very dark sense of humor and cynicism that normal people just have a hard time understanding. And that all comes during a lifetime or a career-long time of dealing with almost completely negative interactions with the public. I just did a news interview regarding a shoplift incident here in Phoenix where some cops were involved. They did a stop, and much of that arrest portion was caught on video, as so much is anymore. And the cops were, quite frankly, doing things they shouldn't have been doing. They were using language they shouldn't have been using and some other things. And I get on there, and I don't and I won't excuse the behavior, but I do hope to maybe give a little bit of understanding as to how and why some cops do these things that they know they shouldn't, that a lot of them look back on even, a couple hours later, and you're like, I shouldn't have done that. None of us are immune, and I certainly have a number of those times that I would look back and say, I should have done things better. So stressful calls that some we may talk about, or you may hear about, or hear something referred to as, any time you deal with the death or traumatic injury of a child, those are tough. Drowning calls specifically. Accidents, vehicle accidents. One of the ones that I remember clearly to this day happened so long ago, but it involved a younger girl who burned to death inside of a vehicle after it crashed. And one of my buddies got there just a little before me, and man, it really tore him up. It really affected him for quite a while. It was just a nasty call. You go to a lot of shootings, you're dealing with domestic violence, where there's these terrible and dreary family situations that, especially for children, they know nothing different, and they can't get out of that. We deal with people assaulting and beating each other up and stabbing each other. Drug addiction. Obviously, we deal with a lot of folks that have drug addiction or alcohol addiction. Mental health is another huge issue that, having a mental health issue is not a crime, but the police have to deal with it. Dead bodies, suicides. Again, it's just that constant negative contact with the public. So if you're a normal person, it's likely the biggest interaction, or I should say the only interaction that you've had with a police officer for the most part, is getting pulled over during a vehicle stop. So I asked the question, were you happy to see us? Were you thankful that you got that ticket that you deserved? Are you happy that you're now late to whatever thing you were running off to? Or were you happy that the cop was perceived as being rude? I'm a retired cop, and I do the same thing everybody else does when they see a cop car on the road. I slow down and hope they didn't see how fast I was going and run the 10 and 2 on the steering wheel and just drive straight. And if I do get pulled over on occasion, as I do, I'm certainly not excited that I'm going to get a ticket, possibly, and get to meet some new police officer. Brings you to another point, paranoia. We may talk about this later, and you're going to hear this term slung around quite a bit in the media and with other people, and a lot of people have different views on this, but my personal opinion is cops need to be paranoid. There's a reasonable level of paranoia, but you have to remember, it is one of about civilian jobs where you are frequently targeted for assault and attack based solely on the uniform that you wear. So think about that. Nobody else has to deal with that type of situation. A dentist doesn't have to worry about getting shot for wearing his dentist clothes into his office. A construction worker's not going to get attacked for loading up his tools to go frame a house because he's a carpenter. Now let's go back to that vehicle stop. When the cop pulls over a vehicle for a vehicle stop, we have absolutely no idea who's driving the vehicle. I mean, obviously, unless it's part of a larger investigation. But for the most part, when that cop pulls that car over, they don't know who's in it. They don't know how many people are in it. They don't know if you may have possibly just committed a robbery or if you may have just killed your wife back at the house and you're leaving. We have no idea. Now, again, because so much is on videotape as witnessed on the news, you can see where these poor cops just get ambushed. They go walking up to these cars and rounds start flying out at them. So again, a little paranoia is, in my opinion and in my experience, that is okay. Part of this job is you're also around a lot of colorful language. Now, I do my best to not use it, and especially since I've kind of gotten out of the job, I'm maybe a little better. I won't profess to be very good, but I'm going to do my best to, again, minimize it with regard to the podcast. I can't make any promises for the folks that I hope to bring on later, but just be aware, and that's part of the disclaimer, is that, again, this is kind of a mature audience type of podcast, and hopefully I won't offend anybody. So another plan that I do, and I kind of alluded to a minute ago, is that I do want to get help from other law enforcement and public safety folks that I've brushed up against during my career, and some of these folks I'm still really good friends with. You know, all of these men and women are going to have just as interesting and entertaining stories as mine, and some of them have better ones, especially some of these folks that have been involved in on-duty shootings, and I hope to get them in with me in the future. Some of the stories that we'll be telling won't necessarily be while on the job, but they'll probably have a direct or inevitable tie to it. And I'm sure there'll be some general life stories or observation type of episodes. And then you're going to hear me make reference to a term of hose dragger. Now, hose dragger is a firefighter, which they're not really firefighters anymore because they probably could count the fires that they fight in a year on one hand. They basically become EMS. I mean, these poor guys are running to medical calls constantly now. Doesn't mean they don't fight the fire, and doesn't mean we don't need them in that capacity by any stretch, but I think years ago that was what you did. You fought fires, whereas now these poor men and women are going to just constant medical calls. Many of them unnecessary. They're kind of fun to talk to as well because they're kind of like cops because you start talking about what calls you should go to and which you shouldn't. But again, they have a great bunch of stories. So anyway, you're going to hear me refer to them as hose draggers. Cops and firemen, or cops and hose draggers, have a funny relationship. Here in the Phoenix area, we get along really well. And when I was in my jurisdiction, we had a great relationship. I never ran across any kind of a complicated call where things didn't click and mesh and do the things they were supposed to do as these two departments had to work together. And to me, as a cop, you know, a hose dragger's kind of like your little brother or your little sister. You give them crap, you still love them, you don't tell them you love them, and if anybody else messes with them, then holy hell's coming to those folks. So when you hear that term hose dragger, that's who I'm talking about. I hope to have episodes where I'll address listener questions or comments about things that they experience or see or hear or something they've heard on my podcast. And I'm not talking about, hey, I got this ticket, or hey, how can I beat a photo radar ticket? I'm not talking about things like that. Something that's got some meat to it and it's got something that we can really get into. I plan to have the probable occasional episode built around a specific topic, such as use of force or an active shooter incident. Hey, why did this cop do X, Y, and Z? And last but not least, I'm going to be flexible as to the direction and kind of see what people are interested in. Start off with podcasts and you hope that you've hit the mark on what people want to hear or what's interesting to them, but you just never know. So I'll be monitoring those things and also monitoring the feedback to make sure that we stay on target and we create a good, interesting, quasi-educational podcast. So with that, I want to wrap up the first of hopefully many episodes of I Barely Got Here. Thank you for listening to an admittedly unexciting episode to start with, but I want everyone to understand where I'm coming from and what experiences I've had and what I plan to do with the podcast. So please check back for new episodes as they come out. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know via my email, ibarelyGotHere@gmail.com, social media, or our webpage, and I'll do my best to address it. Sam42 is 10-7.